Hi guys, welcome to the lecture number 3 of the Docker series. In this lecture we are going to explore a running Docker container. We'll also get to know the Docker run command, that how we actually run a Docker container. We'll get into the Docker container and understand the contents, and we'll think about for a moment that how did we actually get inside it and what is the magic that goes behind it. At the last, we'll also talk about port forwarding, what is it and how Docker achieves that. Here is the agenda for today. First, we'll start by running a Docker container. We actually prepared a Docker container in the last lecture. If you haven't watched that, please do watch it, as it will increase your understanding of this course. The link for that video will be showing up right now at the top of this video. Please click on it and watch that. Secondly, we'll get inside a running Docker container. Thirdly, we'll introspect something about it, that how we got into it, a little about it, because in the later lectures I'm actually going to explain how that works. But for some point, we'll look into it. Then we'll learn and explore the port forwarding. This is actually a good concept, even though you may not need to get into it, but I will still share some technical details, or as in how Docker achieves this port forwarding, and then at the end of it I will give you the solution to the day 2 exercise, in which we just ask you to copy a file inside a Docker container, and then we'll discuss about the exercise that you guys need to do as part of this lecture. So let's begin. I'm in the day 3 folder. Make sure that you guys are in that folder too. If you haven't cloned the repository, please check out the setup video. The link would just be appearing somewhere in this video. So take a look, do that, and come back here. So in the day 3 you're seeing an extra file now, which is commands.md. This is just for your reference, that after I'm done with this video you can just open this file to see all the commands that we'll be using in this lecture. Some extra commands might be there, so just don't be confused about it. I've written enough description on them. So if I do ls on this folder, I'm going to see a Docker file, a readme file. The readme contains the agenda. I'm just going to open the Docker file. So this is almost similar to what we created in the last lecture. We have this base type, some modifications in which we install the softwares, some configuration in which we either expose a port or we declare some environment variables. And at the end of it we have our init script, in which we are just running our HTTP server. So let's just try and run this Docker container. How do we do that? We say docker run the image that we're trying to build. I believe that was day 3, or let me just build the image again for you guys, so it'll be a refresher for you. We do a docker build -t, the tag. I'm going to name it day 3, and I'm going to give the current directory as the context. Remember, the context is where your Docker file resides, so I'm going to give this dot. As you can see that Docker has built the image for me, and now the only thing remaining is to run that image. Command is docker run day 3, and since we have a service inside the Docker, we have an HTTP server that is listening on 9000. I'm just going to do a port forwarding with -p, and I'm just going to write 9000:9000. I'm just going to explain it after this, that what does this -p does and what is the syntax of it. But for now, this is the command to run a Docker container, and you have an option of port forwarding, which is -p. So I'm just going to press enter now. So you saw that the server says that it is started running on port 9000. Let's go on our browser and see what is happening there. So if I open my browser and open localhost 9000, I see that some contents have been listed out here. Since the server is running inside Docker, these contents have been listed, which are actually present in the root of Docker. I'm just going to open another terminal. And let's see, by the way, to see all the running containers, you can do docker container ps, and you see that we have a container image named day3. This is the container ID, some hash that Docker generated for us because we have not given the container name, so it generates a hash for us. It's about a minute ago. We have some ports opened up here which says from my local host 9000 something is redirecting to 9000 TCP, and this is just random name that Docker gave it to it. And let's go inside Docker. So the command is docker exec is to execute, then the container ID, let's just copy that, -it is to have the terminal access to the Docker. Then we write the container ID, and then we write a command. I'm going to write bash because I want to execute the bash shell inside my Docker container. Remember, it's nothing but a Linux container with Python installed on it. So I'm just, since it has the Linux environment, I'm just going to write bash command. So I enter into the bash environment. See, it says that I am at the root, I'm the root user at, and the host name is exactly the same as my container ID. So when I did docker execute and I gave the container ID and I gave a command, so what happens is the Docker ran this container, or if it is actually running, it ran inside it. So this command was run inside this running container, and since this container is a Linux container, bash is a known command, and you enter into the bash shell. And if I do an ls here, instead I'm going to do ls -ltr, and if you see the contents, they are exactly the same as we are seeing here. These are all the things that are listed inside the Docker root, which we are seeing from our web server. So it is for sure that our web server is running inside it and is currently serving the root directory. So now let's get out of the Docker container. I've just pressed Ctrl D now, and I'm just going to do a Ctrl C so that I can stop the Docker container. Right. Now let's look back at the docker run command. We wrote docker run -p 9000:9000 day 3, and this is how we ran the Docker container. But understand that there's an option -p. I've used that option. Why? And what happens if I don't use it? So if I use this, we have already seen that we've been able to access this from our browser. But what if I remove this command and run this Docker container again? Again, it ran fine, and it is still saying the same, that it is serving on port 9000. But this log is actually coming from inside of our Docker. Let's see if I can go on the browser and see something at 9000. it says site cannot be reached. Something is wrong. So what happens, guys? So when I'm requesting something at port 9000, why isn't anything working there? My Docker container is also residing on the system, and my browser is obviously on the system as well. Why aren't the requests from the browsers getting to the Docker container? Well, for one, this also proves that whatever Docker is running inside the same host that your browser is on, it is somehow guarding that container. It is still sandboxing it. So this is what I was talking to you about in the first lecture, that Docker provides you an environment isolation. So whatever is inside, whatever is running inside of that Docker container has not been exposed to the outer world. That is why the request from the browser says this. So let's expose that service to outside. And if I sounded it right, I'm talking about expose. Let's see the Docker file, right? We have exposed a port 9000, but still we are not able to access it. Yes, because something has been exposed on Docker on port 9000, but that port has to be opened on the actual OS, right? So that it can actually act as a port. And on our system, on our Linux, we do not have, if I do this command, netstat is just a command to do all the networking things. I'm just going to use it to find out if there is any open port with number 9000. I'm just going to add a sudo to it just to see if there are any other ports. And you see there are no ports. Now let's run the Docker command again, but this time with port forwarding. Docker run -p 9000:9000 day 3. So now the container is running on port 9000. Let's run the netstat command again to see the output. Now you see that there is some port forwarding going on here. I'm not going to get into details of how netstat works and what is the output that it is showing, but for your sake, this represents the source address and this represents a foreign address. So it means source 9000, which is your host, on port 9000 there has been some rule. These rules are usually the firewall rules that are usually done by the iptables command. But for now, just understand that whenever we did a -p 9000:9000, a firewall rule of forwarding all the packets reaching 9000 on your host has been created. So it forwards all the packets reaching at port 9000 on your host into the Docker container to the port 9000. So the format of this option is -p as the option. Then you write a source port, and then you write the external port. Since we have exposed port 9000 inside Docker, that is why this 9000 occurs. I'm going to show you how you can change this port and run this command again. So I'm going to stop the container. I'm going to edit my file. Now let's expose a different port number this time, and obviously I'm going to run my server on that port as well. And since we have changed in the file, I'm going to build the Docker again. The build is successful, and now I'm going to do a Docker run -p 9000:9000. See, I'm not changing the port here. That means everything landing on 9000 on my host will be forwarded as it is to the 9000 inside Docker. If you have questions in your mind right now, Just hold on. So now the Docker ran. The image is actually running now. Now let's go back onto our browser. So when I refresh the browser, it says the connection was reset. Somehow it is not able to contact the service at port 9000. It's obvious that no port is open 9000. It is obvious that 9000 port was not open inside Docker. So when we do this, we are forwarding everything landing on 9000 to 9000 inside the Docker. But there isn't anything running inside Docker with that port. Instead, we have to mention 9001, which is why I'm going to kill the container, make it 9001, and run it again. And now when you refresh the browser, you see that it is working again. So now you see that even though the port forwarding worked, you were still not able to reach inside the Docker at that port because of the expose keyword that we've used. So make sure that you expose the port on which your service is running, and the same port is used to do a port forwarding when you run the container. Now we'll look at the solution to the day 2 exercise. So the day 2 exercise, if you haven't watched that video, please do watch it. The day 2 exercise was to copy a file inside a running Docker container. And I also gave you the command, which is the copy command. Let's open the Docker file and let's add something here. So from the source, that means this path is relative to your current build context. Again, the build context is where your Docker file exists. So from the current context, I want to transfer foo.txt to the root of Docker. Save this, create a file foo.txt, and it's okay. Let it be an empty file. And now run docker build, since we have changed something in the Docker file. I'm going to write it day 2 exercise and the current build context, which is dot, and I'm going to build it. You saw that it is copying foo.txt into the root. So now let's run Docker again. Please make sure that 9001 is the Docker container port on which we want to forward. This port number can be anything you like. Just make sure that nothing is actually running on it. And we write day 2 exercise, because this is the image that we built just now. So when we do this, a container is running. We go in the browser. You see that this is the older version. It has no file called foo.txt. When we refresh it, we see this file foo.txt, because we have written the copy command inside our in our Docker file. So that is why this got copied here. So I'm going to stop this again. Now let's do a recap of the things that we have learned so far. In this agenda, we have covered how to run a Docker container. We got inside it and explored the concept of port forwarding, and we also understood that how it is actually working under the hood in Docker. So now let's talk about the exercise for today. The first exercise is quite simple. You just need to expose multiple ports. You can do this by the expose command. You can refer to the previous day's lecture and you might find some help. Try moving your init script part of your Docker file into an external script. What I mean by this is that let's open the Docker file for this. So now you see the init script part. I've mentioned an annotation over it. I've written a comment over it, the init script. This is the part I want you to move into an external script. So this is just a command that we're trying to execute. I want you to move this command into an external script and invoke that script instead here. It sounds simple, but there's a little trick involved in it. If you face any problem, please feel free to use the YouTube's comment section and I'll be happy to help you out. And I'll be giving the solution to this problem in the next YouTube video. So stay tuned. So that's it guys for this lecture. I'll cover more details about Docker and how to work with applications in Docker in the later course. For that, do subscribe to my channel. It gives me a lot of motivation to bring this content to you guys. I hope you appreciate all my hard work and subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned and stay home and stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture.